We have some time for questions and answers, and anything that any people have said here that evoked a question, perhaps we were able to take it. David.
My name is David Cullinan. Firstly, just to make an observation that Ireland scores very high on the index of having a very centralised system of governance. That it was mentioned in a number of the presentations that the executive has a huge amount of power in comparison to other countries. So I think it's a mistake from the Oireachtas to give us a very narrow remit in terms of electoral reform, and more specifically reform of the Dáil, because that's the mandate we've been given, to look at Dáil electoral reform. And I don't think you can look at Dáil electoral reform in isolation to political reform generally and the issue of checks and balances in the Oireachtas itself, whether that's the Seanad committees within the Oireachtas and the Dáil itself, and also fundamentally the role of a TD, whether they be a backbench TD or government TD. So I think political reform should have been very much part of our discussions, as well as the electoral reform. And that throws up a number of questions that I have, because the first is in relation to the Seanad. I think it's also a mistake not to look at the electoral system in relation to how we elect people to the Seanad, because we are going to have a referendum, it would seem, and I think we are preempting the outcome of that referendum by not discussing how people are elected to the Seanad, because that is fundamentally undemocratic. And not to have that discussion, I think, could, in some respects, maybe preempt a view that people may necessarily vote in favour of abolition, and that may not be the case. So if people reject the abolition of the Seanad, we'll be left then with the same system, and having missed an opportunity to have a discussion about the Seanad itself, and we'll discuss that in the afternoon, thanks to the Chair's intervention. And I would support this convention discussing the Seanad anyway. But in terms of the remit that we have here, it seems very narrow in terms of Dáil electoral reform, but it should include Seanad reform. The other two crucial issues which have been mentioned is the powers that the executive have. And again, that can only be looked at in the context of overall overarching reform of the Oireachtas, but that's not our remit, and I think we should be given the opportunity to discuss that, because it's just impossible to have a comprehensive review of the electoral system without looking, as I said, at the overall political system. And the last point is in relation to clientelism and localism, which has been mentioned by Niamh. And just a question to Niamh specifically on this, because there is a perception that if we can change the electoral system, that in itself will deal with this whole notion of localism and clientelism. But my experience as a public representative for many years is that's not the case, and that one of the fundamental problems is the reason why people come to their TD to get things fixed, whether it is the medical card or some social welfare application, is because they get a very poor service from those departments themselves. They can't get access to people who work in those offices to get answers to their claims, so they're forced then to go to their politicians. And also we have a very weak system of local government, and maybe those areas should come under local government, and that would solve the problem. So I think in some respects, when we look at that issue of localism, we at times tend to look at the electoral issues in relation to the changes to the electoral system will solve the problem, where in fact I think it's deeper than that in terms of reforming local government, but also making sure that people have access. First of all, they have rights. They shouldn't have to go to a politician to get any of these things sorted out. But second of all, there should be a better public interface from those services, that people should be able to contact people themselves and get responses. Okay. So just if that could be responded to as well.
Thank you. I'm going to take a couple of questions or comments now before going back to the panel. Joanna.
Thanks. Well, I just had 2 points.
Again, could you just your name, please? Because
Joanna Tuffy, Dublin Midwest constituency. No, I just had 2 points. One relates to that just made by Senator David Cullinan, and that is that I just would hope that maybe the panel would clarify. Our system, like clientelism is not a correct word to use about the Irish system. Clientelism is basically, the definition of that is basically that, people are bribed. Basically, money changes hands to get public officials to do certain things. Whereas, that's not what, like, if someone coming to you who is, a negative equity to your constituency, that's not clientelism. So that's one point. And localism, again, I think is misused in the Irish debate, because much of what a TD is contacted about by their constituency is to do with how national decisions affect them as individuals or in their local communities. So that's not localism, that's national politics playing out on the local stage, which is a different thing. And the other point I just wanted to make was just the thing about experts. Like, the person I most admire as a minister is actually a British minister, the late Aneurin Bevan, and he established the NHS, which has stood the test of time in Britain as the health service, public health system. He left school at 13 and went to work in the mines. Subsequently became an activist in the trade union movement. So, like, this idea of expertise is actually quite elitist. Just to make that point as well.
Okay, thank you. Maureen.
Maureen O'Sullivan. It's almost in fear and trepidation I'm asking this, but I'm wondering what Professor Marsh would have to say about the role of independence in the more recent elections. Thank you.
Okay, I'll take one or two more comments if there are. If not, we'll go directly. Okay. Yeah, yourself. Name, please, again.
Hi, good morning, everybody. First of all, I'd like to thank speakers. I'm Pat Hunt. Just briefly, I just have 3 points and 3 questions, really. It's in relation to the whole issue of, first of all, the point that was raised by Niamh in relation to the lack of professionalism within the government and indeed within the civil service. We've had just a number of doctors in the Department of Health. We've had a number of lawyers in the Department of Justice. And it doesn't necessarily mean we've had any better running of government or indeed running of those government departments. The next thing I would like to raise is the whole issue, and something that David has pointed out as well, is the lack of development of local government. If we had a stronger local government wing, then surely it would take away what can be described as the begging bowl attitude by us, the general public, to TDs, to actually facilitate services or indeed look at areas of local concern. So perhaps if we had a better development of local government, then it would certainly free up central government and government ministers and TDs to look at those important issues of legislature and issues of international concern. Finally, then, the last thing is just an observation. It relates as much to the political parties, as Muiris pointed out at the initial talk, is that we can't discuss politics without looking at political parties. And is it a question that we get the politicians we deserve, or rather, is it a case we get the politicians that the government parties think we deserve? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Maybe we'll go. Okay, yourself, and then we'll go to the panel.
John Connolly, Dublin. It's not so very long ago that a key word in our average conversation was gerrymandering. We saw the absolute disintegration of a make-believe state by reason of their exercise of gerrymandering. It is tremendously important to avoid this for the future, given that a recent Time magazine suggested that when they go to the polls, that there's only a reasonable chance of having a 45 personnel change in their electoral system. This can't be healthy for any democratic society. So I think probably one of the major recommendations coming from this convention should be the laying down of an independent electoral commission which would meet on a regular outline basis according to tidied up rules compared with what it had been previously. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And let's go to the panel. Maybe we'll start with you, Michael, and we'll go across. And if whatever issues you want to pick up there.
Let me just...
microphone, maybe get closer. Yeah.
Let me just pick up a few of those. The first one, Independent Electoral Commission, I think, yes, I think, capital letters, yes, we should have one. The last government said it would bring one in, and some work was done, but we didn't get there. But I think many people would like to see that, as they have in other countries. Independence, I remember being asked that on television by Brian Dobson. He said, "You've got 45 seconds. What do you think about independence?" And I said, "Too many of them." to broaden that out a little bit, independents as your local TD, fine. They may be much better than anybody else you could get. Do a better job, popularise issues, raise profiles, work hard, terrific. But to have a government that's actually dependent on one or two TDs who rip off the rest of us in order to channel money to their own constituencies, I think that's disastrous. I think that's fundamentally undemocratic. And if I had an electoral system that meant we couldn't have any independence, I wouldn't see that as a loss from that particular perspective. Electoral system independently of anything else. When they used to have these long discussions north of the border, they used to say nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. But I think we have to do these things one thing at a time.
Okay, thanks, Michael. Niamh?
Yeah. Expertise is elitist. Well, I work in a university. I think that knowledge is always a good thing. It's better to be better informed than not. But I wouldn't want to suggest that we have an absolute choice between expertise and political skill. What I think I was suggesting was the respect in which Ireland is out on a limb compared with in a spectrum of European countries in excluding the option of having other sorts of skill mixes as part of the political process, either particularly in government. So there's no guarantee that somebody who has a specialist expertise in law or health or anything else is going to make a better government minister. And ministers can be extremely able in learning about their policy brief and then in executing it because they know how the system works. And system knowledge is incredibly important for political effectiveness. So I don't think it's an either or sort of choice in any of this. I think this point about people's rights, people knowing their rights and the rights being clear, fair and accessible is incredibly important because I think that, as Michael pointed out to us, when people are asked, what do you use your TD for? Very often it's to get things done that should be done in some other way. I have a direct experience of this myself. It's about local traffic lights. Like many people here will have had this experience. You know, we live in a cul-de-sac with a blind corner and for years, the Residents' Association was trying to get traffic lights at the end of the road so we wouldn't risk our lives coming out and turning right against this blind corner. And when I moved into the area, I started lobbying the TDs like everybody else. And I said, wait a minute, I'm a political scientist. I know this is stupid. So I found out where the decisions were made in the local authority. I started ringing up the corporation, the councillors. I found out where the decisions were made. And I take credit for getting those traffic lights myself. Simply because there was a question of actually telling people in one office that some point in the decision-making process had happened and the next thing could happen. There were gaps in the system. Linking things up is something that we ask our national politicians to do. Well, that's really a really inefficient use of their time. So rights, information, transparency, effectiveness, very, very important indeed. But I think that link between politicians and local constituents is very important. I think Ireland does have a very strong advantage in people's sense of connection with the political system. One phenomenon that we do see across Europe, and perhaps most strongly in Italy, where they have no choice over the individuals that are elected, they just vote for the party list, is this sense that they have no control over who is in Parliament. And it makes people feel very disaffected from the political system. I mean, we regard politics as a great spectator sport here, I think, still in this country, because people do feel involved and connected. They know their local politician, that's a good thing. But the final thing that I just want to return to is this point about accountability. I mean, I really do think that the mechanisms for ensuring accountability within the Oireachtas and specifically within the Dáil, making the committee stronger, is very important. And this does raise other issues about other aspects of constitutional reform because the people had a chance to vote on the Abbey Lara decision in 2011 and they voted not to strengthen Dáil committees, the investigative powers of Dáil committees. And I think that, in my view, this was, I was disappointed about this. But it may not be the last word on the issue because I think that as people come to understand really what's at stake in balancing the powers, the checks and balances within our system, maybe the climate debate might change on this one.
Thanks, Niamh. Marsh?
Thank you very much. Niamh has covered a couple of points I was going to make there. I'd go back to David Cullinan's issue there about the power of the executive. In preparation for the briefing paper for today, I actually went back and looked at the 1922 Constitution, and it was really very striking that, you know, the Irish co-authors of that, along with the British co-authors, they really were determined they did not want to see happening what was emerging in Westminster at that time, and that was very much a party-controlled parliamentary system of single-party government, as in a single-party controlling parliament. And they went out of their way to include provisions that would allow, in effect, for the opposition to double-check what it was the executive was doing. Now, unfortunately, because of the Civil War, and very quickly Ireland descended into in effect, a us versus them parliamentary situation, which is carried on. Those provisions disappeared, and they never reappeared in the current constitution, which we're interested in, the 1937 constitution. And so the relationship with the electoral system, it's difficult, but when you look at the rules governing the way Dáil Éireann does its business, any amendments that have happened since 1937 have pretty much given increased control to the executive and less opportunity to the opposition. Some exceptions in recent years, it must be admitted, but by and large. And so we have this, again, going back to the points made in the presentations, that the Irish Parliament is out almost on its own in many respects in comparison with other legislatures. I mean, we were all shocked when we heard about the German Parliament, knowing how well Ireland was doing in terms of the economic adjustment programme. The German Parliament was getting this evidence before the Irish Parliament was, but of course in Germany it's perfectly normal. The Parliament, it's built in, it has quite strong rights to see documents that government has, whereas we don't have that situation in Ireland. Again, you can argue about, well, so what? What's this got to do with the electoral system? But it's something in our culture. It goes back to the issue, perhaps, a little bit of clientelism. And, you know, I'd agree with Joanna Tuffy. I mean, I don't want to denigrate the people by any means who have been in as ministers. I mean, I often think of Ray McSharry, you know, a wonderful cattle dealer, one of the best ministers of finance, you know, maybe we ever had. But there is something nowadays, the complexity, contemporary governing requires very high levels of skill, and it's a concern, you know, we're in a small country that we are, that, you know, we should be really getting very good people into office, and we are limited. Our constitution says you can only get the people into cabinet from this pool, and who's in this pool is the question. And are we getting the best people in there? I'll stop. I would say, I mean, a lot of countries do, just in terms of the executive, I don't want to, there's another side to this argument that a lot of people outside of Ireland will admire the Irish system of government because it's we can do things relatively quickly. Irish governments can do things quite fast compared to other parliamentary systems as well. So that must be recognised. But I would have a concern about the accountability issue. Thank you.